All right. So with that, thank you, Jennifer, for setting up our recording. On to today's program. So as you know, many companies have been very quick in the past few years, particularly to make supportive statements around the ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think we are all increasingly aware that those statements are quite honestly not sufficient in order to really support their employees and build the kind of diverse, equitable, inclusive teams that companies very often talk about wanting. Concrete actions, formalized programs, really intentional efforts go a long way to ensuring that those statements are reflected in material ways. And as much as the human case of DEI programs is huge, and I think we're all aware of, there's also a business benefit to be acquired through these efforts. Studies routinely show that diverse teams are better at problem solving, they're more adaptable, they're more creative, just generally more successful. And in an era of increasing consumer pressure on brands to be good corporate citizens, a robust DEI programs go a long way to preventing avoidable and also very costly missteps. So with that, before we get started, I'd love to introduce you to our panelists. We have Robin Tompkins and Kerina Koch with us. Robin, if you want to get started and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you for inviting me here to participate today. I run a consultancy called Olive Hill that's based right outside of Portland, Oregon. We work with companies, organizations, nonprofits from around the United States on a lot of different areas along with DEI. We work with boards on succession planning, DEI, strategic planning, leadership. We also work with VC-backed companies, startups, and we also offer executive coaching. I'm so excited to talk about this issue. I've worked in this area for 3 decades and have seen a lot of change and hope to see a lot more. So glad to be here today.
Great, thank you so much, Robin. And Kerina, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kerina, and my pronouns are she, her. I actually work with Brittany over at Wetherby. I'm a senior operations associate. Wetherby is an investment advisory firm based out of San Francisco. We also have some offices in New York and Los Angeles and Seattle. We're also a B Corp and have a large footprint in the impact investing industry, where we focus on trying to create value for all stakeholders, which includes our clients, but also puts a priority on supporting our employees and community at large. I was a founding member of our firm's DEI committee, which was started back in 2019, and have been a co-chair of our committee since 2021. Earlier this year, our company merged with another investment advisory firm, where I've been a member of the team responsible for developing the DEI missions, values, and strategy for the combined entity. I'm really excited to be here with everyone and appreciate the opportunity to speak on it more.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, both of you so much for being here. So Robin, you touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to start with you. As you said, you've been involved in the DEI space for a long time. I'd love to get a sense of how you've seen things change over the years.
Interesting question. You know, I was thinking on that in preparation for today's discussion. Without giving too much detail on when I started some 1,000 years ago, I remember when I started in the corporate world. Back then, issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, although it wasn't called that, were probably led and promoted from the HR department out of a compliance component. And oftentimes that was with the oversight of legal, thinking about, you know, what kind of exposure a company might have. And early on, it had more to do around sex discrimination, sexual harassment type things. And I all too often remember a day would be set aside in during the year when employees would have to take compliance training. You'd sit in your little cubicle or your office, and you'd watch these vignettes on your screen, and then they would ask you, did he or she do the right thing? And you tick the box and you answer it, and then lo and behold, you'd get this little certificate and you were deemed complied, and you conformed with, you know, whatever training requirement that you had for the year. And the company felt like, okay, all the employees got the information. We, you know, did what we were supposed to do. And that was the extent of things, really. And then I think gradually you began to see, with more progressive and usually larger companies, corporations, you would have the start of employee relations groups where you'd have ERGs within an organization. And sometimes they would be around different affinities, but then you would have like the African American or Black group or the Hispanic group back in the day. They would use the term Hispanic. Sometimes they still do. And then more recently, you would have sexual identity or other affinity groups. And you'd see sort of progression slowly within the corporate arena, thinking about, you know, our employees, and they may have some desire for some support within organizations. Then you would also see sort of the evolution of an awareness of recruiting, when people would point out that maybe the demographics of a company weren't as diverse as either they would like or external stakeholders pointed to them. So there were efforts there. But it was usually piecemeal, hit or miss, and those were sort of the starting points of diversity early on, I think.
Great, I love that background, and I have very vivid memories of the very silly vignettes and the compliance training. So that is not as far in the past as maybe some of us might think. So moving on for both of you, let's start with sort of, I think, kind of the very beginning, as they say. What do you think is sort of the meaningful difference between a DEI statement or some sort of very well-meaning public relations release or something along those lines, and an actual DEI program?
Kerina, you want to speak to this one first?
Sure. I'd say a DEI statement demonstrates the company's intentions and is a formal commitment around the company advancing these values. I'd say it sets the foundation and overarching direction the company wants to go when it comes to DEI, whereas a DEI program specifically outlines the actions and activities needed to take these abstract concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then practically apply them within the workplace.
I'd agree 100% with that. I think when I was thinking about this, I wanted to pull back, maybe, if you allow me, more of a macro level and kind of look at, well, what are we talking about when we talk about DEI, right? And when we even go out with a statement versus a program, usually when I'm engaged with an organization or a company or board, it's the why. Why are we doing this, right? Before we even get to the statement and the program and how valuable either one is, what is your intent? What is your purpose? And why are you doing this? I think that drives a lot of what ultimately is contained in the statement and how the program is developed and delivered and monitored. So although those are accurate descriptions, I really try to engage with a company or organization and try to really have them reflect, number one, you know, why are we doing that? Because that will drive the architecture and the deliverable. And so I think a lot along those lines as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate and cogent point, that the why is really what a lot of this comes down to. And it speaks to what you were talking about earlier about, everything being from a sort of a compliance perspective early on. That's a very different goal than something like maybe you might see in a firm that has a really robust program now. So that's actually a very good segue into my next question, which is, when you're thinking about putting together a program, have there been specific flashpoints or inspirations that really made you go, oh, this is why we need a program, or this is when we need to take this step?
Well, I'd even ask, well, I think if you scan back over the last 2, 3, 5 years, there have been so many external events that companies, organizations, entities have had to respond to, whether they wanted to or not, that have fallen within this realm. Whether they have been, and when we're talking about here in the US, issues about race relations, whether it's George Floyd or Asian Americans being attacked, or whether there are laws that are promulgated in different states that talk about sexual identity and conversations around that, or whether you have companies now grappling with how to respond to the recent Supreme Court ruling around abortion and reproductive health, and how that filters down and affects their employees, and also whether it aligns with their corporate values. Are they a corporation or organization or entity that its brand is seen as values led, right? Some wade very easily into those conversations. Some are very hesitant to get involved in those conversations. Yet, because external events happening, they don't get to sit on the sideline. So companies are now, and boards are now recognizing it is better to have those conversations and be proactive and understand, what are our core values? What do we stand for? And have that be a pillar within your organization, not only for your employees, but for your stakeholders, for your shareholders, for your consumers, so they know who you are. And so that when these situations occur, they don't get the impression that you're just giving lip service or spin, or you're hopping on the bandwagon to get PR credits because of something. I think to get ahead of it and to really be thoughtful about what is sort of our anchor. Where do we come from? A place where we can legitimately speak to all of these parties is very important. But I'd be interested in hearing from Kerina about how they work through that in your organization.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up about the corporate values. I'm happy to be part of an organization that is a B Corp, where we are trying to progress and advance past just making profits for the company. The B Corp certification, just to provide a little bit more context, it's a certification that's awarded to businesses that have a higher standard of corporate social responsibility, and looks at purpose and impact. So we were already a B Corp for 3 years prior to the DEI program being started. That kind of openness and desire to want to be a better business for the community as a whole really allowed our leadership to be open to the creation of DEI and recognizing the need for DEI within the workplace. not to just better serve our clients, but to also provide a better experience for our employees, help them grow with us.
Great. Thank you both. This is kind of a perfect segue. Again, Robin, you mentioned this, but when you're talking about things like COVID, the murder of George Floyd, overturning Roe versus Wade, the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, the anti-Asian hate crimes, all of these, unfortunately, this kind of influx of really kind of world historical terrible events. What do you feel like the role of a company's DEI program it can or should be in addressing those things?
Well, I think it could be multi-level. I think number one, from the top down, and I don't think it's necessarily what the role of the DEI program should be. I think it should be what the role of the leadership within that organization, the executive and officer team, the board, and your department or division heads sort of signal to both the employees, consumers, and shareholders. And I think that is when those events happen, to be as, number one, thoughtful about what the employee needs as far as safe space. Let's just take a case in point when George Floyd happened. It wasn't the first incident that here in the US we had seen, unfortunately, but I think we can all agree for a myriad of reasons, it touched so many people in such a different way, and it delivered a different impact. And it almost called for a different type of communication. And whether or not people very hesitant when there are heightened in visceral sort of images that can create strong emotions. Oftentimes companies don't want to bring that into the workplace for fear of how they will handle it. But I think employees want to know that their humanity doesn't get left on the front doorstep of the office. They bring that to work with them. They carry it that with them, whether they are a member of that community or not. They're having a reaction to that, and they need a safe environment in which to have discussion. And so I think the role of, whether it's within the DEI program, and hopefully the program has been structured in ways that allows for employee earnest communication that flows not just laterally or within a division, but flows up and back down through the company, so that you know that the organization is taking in information, it's supporting its workforce, it's hearing what is needed during a critical time, it's making course corrections or additions if need be through benefits or time off, or using it as learning opportunities within the organization. I think that's a crucial piece, an opportunity that shouldn't be missed. And then I also think if you are a company or organization that has a position in your community that necessarily will look to you in this time, you have to speak from a position of you have to be authentic in your communications. I know you want to get the marketing group and PR department all engaged in spinning it and yeah, we support this and we support that. But I sometimes think that making a statement and saying, you know, we recognize that XYZ has happened. This is significant, and we're going to take some time to digest this and then get back to you with something that is thoughtful, that has some impact and has some commitment from which we will be held accountable, is more beneficial than the rush to, yes, you know, we agree, you know, this is wrong and we don't condone this. So I think there's a lot of different ways, both internal to a company and external, that you are using some of the pieces of your DEI work and your program to communicate both inward and externally to those constituencies.
I love that comment about that sometimes you're better off taking some time and sort of digesting it and acknowledging that this is not something you have an easy answer for.
Mm-hmm.
Kerina, since you are sort of on the ground, such as it were, in a program, I'd love to hear your perspective on how you've seen some of these kinds of issues addressed.
Yeah, so I completely agree with Robin. Each day we are overwhelmed, you know, with various stories of injustices that are occurring, you know, globally, nationally, and even, you know, in our local communities. But the collective trauma that we as a society are experiencing doesn't disappear once we, you know, enter the workplace or, you know, log on. So I think it's important for leadership to create the safe spaces for their employees, with a special care on those employees who are, you know, members of the group experiencing the harm. So in regards to George Floyd, our company did send out a communication to our network acknowledging the tragedy, as well as providing some resources on how we as individuals can help combat systemic racism. So ways to educate yourself, ways to get involved. And then internally, we started a Better Allies book club that created a space for employees to read books around social justice, and then have them practice participating in these difficult discussions with each other. So that way, you know, we can take our learnings and just different perspectives and then extend it out to like our networks.
Great, thank you. And I have to say, as a participant in the book club, I think it's been great. So you've both spoken about the need for leadership and the fact that this has to come from the top down, or at least in part. How have you grappled with getting buy-in? Obviously, sometimes it's easier than others, but both from leadership and from sort of the team as a whole into these programs.
I, for one, think that it's essential. I think in this day and age, it is essential to have this conversation in your C-suite, at your officers meeting, and at your board level. And I'd like to sort of back up, because we've talked a little bit about, we use DEI. So we're talking about diversity and we're talking about inclusion. They are not the same thing. It's not an issue of diversity and stir, like let's go out and get all the different people and put them around the table and that resolves our issues, right? That's not the deal. I think many of you have heard the statement, diversity is being asked to the dance, or being invited to the dance, and inclusion is being asked to dance. And I think taking one thing at a time and having the conversation about the why, and then getting buy-in from both board level and executives that this is something that we not should, but must embark in. And I know there's a lot of literature and a lot of studies that talk about business case and things like that, but that's been around for decades. And obviously that hasn't really moved the needle much. But I think what we're seeing from research from many of the organizations that work with leadership development and talent with global organizations is that there's a huge changeover in C-suite individuals across the globe because companies are recognizing that those leaders they aren't equipped with the skill set that's needed to lead this new dynamic group of companies, the employees in these companies. And so we're looking at leadership with emotional intelligence that's willing to learn and dig in and really understand why both diversity and inclusion promotes innovation, high retention, advancement at work, creativity, and the like. And so unless you get buy-in at those levels, what happens is oftentimes you get this disconnect of having a program, but yet still getting sort of these glass ceilings or these blockages because you really don't get to the deeper work of a program, which is, as Kerina said, thinking about how to restructure systems and structures that may unconsciously be biased or programmed in a way that doesn't promote up or support all of your employees within an organization, and or encourage the rigor that you bring to the table around making financial decisions to all of your human resource and DEI decisions. And for you to have that kind of robust DEI program that really works, at the end of the day, you need your top line executives to buy off on that. And ultimately, how do you buy off on that? It has to be part of their evaluation, so part of their compensation plans. And you're seeing that more and more with major companies, whether it's at Nike and other places, where part of their evaluation is part of demonstrating sort of what they're delivering in that DEI sphere. So it's not just a program or a department that's set off on the side. It is something that every manager, every level leader is charged with doing for the betterment of the company. Kerina, do you have any on-hand sort of insight as to how your group worked with the executives there when rolling out your program?
Yeah, when it comes to this sort of work, it's really important to recognize that each person is at a different place when it comes to their understanding to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So with that said, we did have the opportunity to work with each individual member of our management committee and have interviews with them kind of to gauge their understanding of what we're doing. And initially, like when we had our proposal, everyone is on board. It's just like, how do we roll this out? So that's kind of where like hesitance comes, like people have different strategies. So in order to get more buy-in from leadership, which is critical to the success of a program, so it's not siloed in one place, we really want to integrate this out into all aspects of the business. We were very thoughtful in basing our programs on 4 strategic business pillars, with each pillar relating to certain aspects of the business. The first one is leadership and organizational culture, just to really nail in how important leadership is to the development of these programs. The second pillar was hiring pathways. The third was retention, development, and advancement. And the fourth is more external facing, and it's building out networks of support within the industry. So while these strategic pillars are very broad, we have specific activities associated with each one, and it allows us the flexibility to change this over time, change it based off of resourcing needs. And that structure really helped, I think, our leadership understand, how wide ranging we want this program to be, and seeing how a DEI program can help add value to the business.
Right. I think the moral of the story, I think, is that you can't really do this without leadership. As much as you would love to be able to snap your fingers sometimes and make it happen, but you've got to have that support from the top of the ladder. So when we talk about these programs, getting sort of a little bit more into kind of the nitty gritty of it a little bit, what do you think have been the most important elements of programs that you've seen be successful, or Kerina, that's the program, the program that you've worked with?
I think, at least with our program, I think the most important element is training. There should always be like a foundational training to level set those who are maybe not as far along in their DEI journey. And then you can have trainings build from there. At Wetherby, we delivered trainings that can be applied to everyone's core job responsibilities. We found ways, like we had a workshop on how to better serve women clients. And after all of these trainings, we do send out surveys to all the attendees and ask, gather feedback. And based on their feedback, we try to curate a workshop that's relevant to them. And from that, we've developed a training curriculum that includes imposter syndrome and how to run inclusive meetings. But I know sometimes, like when people think of trainings, it's always like this focus, it's like the same sort of trainings. We try to find ways to expand out DEI into, other aspects of the business, so it isn't siloed. Like that's really critical to see how these concepts can be applied into your everyday work.
I didn't want to cut you off, Kerina. Were you done?
Oh yeah, I'm done.
I would add some of the components that I have seen work best is, well, the first thing is data collection. I think it's very difficult to determine where you are from a baseline and where you want to go without having data. And data collection within your own organization, and then taking a hard look at that. And then through your program also, it's incredibly important to have KPIs to measure. So to figure out what your metrics are going to be, what is it that you want to measure, right? Over the course of time, whether it's in recruitment, whether it's in retention, whether it's in promotions, how you evaluate your key individuals, all of that, and have key performance indicators and measurements so that you can track how you are progressing. So I think that, to align with training, helps a company keep an eye on whether it's progressing toward its goals or not. And if it isn't, then to take a hard look at, do we need to course correct? Is there something else that we have to add to this? Are there focus groups that we need to go out and find out why isn't this working? We thought that we would implement this. But if you don't have the data, I mean, companies are wonderful at collecting data and scrubbing it and analyzing it for a whole host of other things. We don't do that on the human side of things. And we can, and we do it to some degree when we want to promote sort of high flyers and things like that. But we can put that same kind of rigor involved in our DEI programs as it pertains to our employees. Just like you have data, whether you have external contractors and you want to diversify that, or, have voices in your stakeholder groups, or in different levels of your company, both externally and internally. So I would strongly recommend that key components of a very robust DEI program has, measurement tools that you come back to periodically.
Yeah, I think the data collection and the measurement is very interesting, because I think it's very easy sometimes for people to write this sort of program off as, oh, well, it's all qualitative. There's nothing quantitative that you can measure. There's nothing you can actually track. And I think you're absolutely right. There is, I promise there is. And I think absolutely can have a huge impact.
And
so
I guess
speaking on, go ahead.
Oh, and speaking on data collection, that's something that it is a struggle for us to be like, which metrics should we be tracking? Which ones make sense to track? And like, which one is actually, feasible to track on and at what frequency? So we do depend a lot on, surveys and, getting feedback from employees to help kind of figure out what projects we're going to prioritize. But yeah, in terms, we have these ideas of like what we would want to track, but like as we went through it, it was kind of difficult to keep track of certain metrics. But we found, at least within our org, that surveys from employees and hearing what they like to see was really beneficial.
Great. To both of you talked about this idea, I think, Robert, I think your analogy is that you can't just dump everybody in the pot and stir. How have you seen, like, basically, what do you think the role of DEI is, both in the recruiting side of it and then in the sort of retention development side of it? And how have you seen those really differ? Where do you feel like those diverge?
Well, it's interesting because sometimes the question is so broad. You say, what is, again, I get back to the why and the values for the company. There are lots of companies that ostensibly don't see a reason to change. So we're just ticking over very fine, doing our own thing. We don't necessarily think that we need to recruit from a broader pool of people, but hopefully either customers, shareholders, constituents, externally or organically internally, they look around and say, hey, we're all men here, or we're all women here, or we're all this or that, and we could benefit from having different perspectives, opinions, skill sets, what have you. So what does diversity play in recruitment? The age-old sort of statement that, sure, we don't have anything against women, we just can't, there are not enough women who are interested in STEM, so we don't have them in these tech companies or leading these VC companies or what have you. It's, where are you casting your net to recruit the population of prospective employees? And how are you thinking about the skill set of the jobs that you're bringing people in for on your recruitment? I think we have some very standardized ideas. And actually, I have to say, I have seen some really innovative approaches now, not only in tech and Silicon Valley, but in other areas, thinking about how to reframe sort of those job opportunities and how to have gender and racial and ethnic sort of keys stripped out of the applications and resumes so that they are viewed in more of a neutral realm. So some of our unconscious bias don't crop in, and all of us have them. I mean, none of us are immune to them. We are creatures of our environments and our upbringings and our experiences. And so the more we can challenge ourselves to think about that, even if you're having interview panels, the more diverse that panel can be, so that you have more than one individual making that decision, hiring decision or promotion decision. So when you're thinking about sort of that diversity issue of reaching out and recruiting folks, that's extremely important to try to neutralize some of the inherent bias in that. And think about also, where are you casting your net for potential applicants? On the retention side, you need to really lean into, and we can do a whole nother discussion because there's just so much research that goes into the inclusion part of DEI, which is almost, if not more important, because if you don't really think of the work that you have to do to make sure that your employee spaces are set up for those individuals that you're bringing in to thrive, you've wasted a whole vast amount of money. HR can tell you how much expense they incur bringing in somebody, getting them up, trained and stuff, and then to have people leave because dissatisfaction or lack of advancement within an organization. And if you spent some of that time thinking about how do we get the best out of the talent that we are bringing in, how do we mentor, how do we sponsor, how do we make safe spaces, how do we make sure that they feel like they can show up being just who they are, right? And they don't have to check a whole portion of their personality at the door when they come in to be conforming. So that's the other side of the DEI program that works on the retention side.
Yeah, in regards to recruitment, we have done a lot of work around removing biases in the hiring process. So I haven't heard of the tool to remove, gendered language from resumes, but what we've done is we've run all our job descriptions and postings through an augmented writing program to do the same thing. So to remove gendered language from our job postings. So we did that for all our roles. And then when it comes to the interview process, we have interview kickoff meetings with the interviewers that offer, a brief training on the process and how to maintain consistency across different candidates. So we created a question bank where each interviewer pulls the same question and they'll ask all those questions across all the different candidates. And then we also want our interviewers to submit their evaluations within, 24 hours of the interview to remove recency bias. So we've definitely, we've done a lot of work to get to this place. We're continuing to do work. Eventually we would want to move on to blind resume review, but we're screening tools for that. And yeah, like you said, when it comes to retention and growth, all this work around recruitment doesn't mean anything if we aren't creating an inclusive environment where people feel like they can show up. So what we've done is we have a mentorship program, and we also have, professional development stipends where people feel like they can, take courses to help them grow, like where they would want to, participate and engage and bring their best self to work. And another thing that, we started a couple of years ago was looking a little bit early, and this is back to recruitment, going a little bit earlier into the candidate pipeline as we started a formal internship program where we work with a local nonprofit that works with students in the neighborhood, and we bring them in because a lot of people don't have access, or at least when I was a student too, like a lot of people aren't exposed to the wealth advisory industry. So this gives us an opportunity to expose, this financial services industry to underrepresented groups within finance, starting very early on.
That's excellent. If I may say so myself. That's very good.
Thank you. We're trying, always learning.
I think what you've hit on is a key point. It's iterative, right? The more you do, some things work, some things don't. We're never going to be perfect at this, but it's the point is, you're constantly evaluating and you're getting better. And that learning culture is key to that. And I bet that's exactly what you're experiencing within your company.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. You definitely have to be okay with making mistakes, and learning, because what works at one workplace might not work at another one.
Exactly.
It just depends on the culture and the people there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as we get close to the end of our time, the final and sort of sub-level biggest question is, what's the next step in these programs? If we're lucky enough to work someplace that has a program, how do we make it better? And sort of where do you see the role of these programs going?
Kira, I'm going to let you go first.
At least for me, I eventually see, the role of DEI programs, like, this is very far off, like they wouldn't need to exist. A lot of these, if you're a company that supports these values, a lot of these values are already seamlessly integrated into your day-to-day work. So eventually, the specific, like program wouldn't need to be there. It's already built into the values. But I'd say in terms of like the next steps, like in the short term, it's probably for companies, to have a dedicated officer or team to help administer these initiatives. It is a lot of work to take on, especially if you're starting from scratch. And so I think it's important to have someone collaborate with, different departments and, help with advocate, help with educating, and finding ways for them to integrate these values into their roles.
To amplify on that last point that Kira raised about having dedicated department, I would say to make sure that it's well resourced. Oftentimes I'll see these departments and they aren't resourced. I think that they should be directly reporting to the CEO of your organization. I think where it sits in an organization gives employees an understanding or a signal of how important it is as a priority. If you're a publicly listed company, or even if you aren't, and you report out to shareholders or constituents in your annual report, you should speak to what you're doing, both all of the wonderful things you're doing and the areas where you think you need work on. I think people are so used to whether this comes under the ESG component of reporting out, of a spin, right? You run it through your PR department and say all the wonderful things. But I think sometimes it lands more genuinely where you say, hey, we've noticed that X, Y, and Z we've had a high turnover of this. Or even if you talk about COVID, I think it's reported here in the United States, I mean, the vast number of women that had to step back from the workforce. And we realized that they had to do that because of the issues of homeschooling and all of these other things. And we are thinking about different ways to address the needs of our female population or whatever it is. I think the way that you can be more transparent, that this is a learning process, that we are making strides here. We're not moving as fast here. We are looking to work with our partners in the community in different ways. We are open to learning. I think that's really important. So part of the DEI program, and then also saying, okay, we put these metrics in place and this is how we did. We met and we exceeded, and here we fell short. And this is what we're going to do to address that gap. I think that builds trust. Trust is key for these type of things, to change behaviors, to change people's opinions. There has to be trust, and they also have to see change happen. And so I don't think there has to be dramatic, like next step. I really do think the work of it has to go deeper and then be more transparent in the communication so that you have more trust built. I think that would be my next step.
That's fantastic. Well, we have a couple minutes left to take questions. We have one that we can start with, but if anyone else has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. So question is, do you find that the sort of motivation to implement these programs is starting to come more from leadership, or is it really still coming from sort of ground level employees going up to leadership saying, hey, we need to have this? And does that sort of, have you seen it be different in different companies of different sizes?
Well, I can speak to just my experience. I think a lot of it depends on industries. So industry sectors and sort of globally, from my understanding from colleagues, you're seeing more activism with shareholders. In fact, I thought, is it the year before last, you saw your first two, don't quote me on this, shareholder sort of lawsuits on a lack of diversity basis. So you have more activism in that area. And I think leaders are being, I don't want to say forced externally. Sometimes those pressures are coming externally. Sometimes there's just an awareness that they do need to change. I think even as you've heard, I think a couple of years ago, Jamie Dimon said in the Business Roundtable that corporations are taking a new perspective on their responsibilities, and it's not just to make profit, and it's not just to the shareholder, right? And so if we're having leadership think about that, if we're having companies and think about who's in the boardroom, who's leading companies, you're getting more of an impetus for that. That's not across the board. There are some industries and sectors that still, for them, the business case or what have you, the status quo hasn't seen them move the needle, and that pressure is still from the employee side of it. So I think it really is, at least from my experience, dependent on where you are in the life cycle of a business, what industry, and what segment of your employee population, the demographics of your employee population also play a factor.
Great. Well, that was a perfect plug for the Business Roundtable statement from a couple of years ago. We'll be covering that later in the summer. We are right at the 3rd anniversary of that statement from the Business Roundtable on the purpose of a corporation. So stay tuned. Well, as we wrap up here, thank you so much to Robin and Kerina for joining us. We'll be sending out a survey after the event, so a little later today, asking those of you who attended what you would like to see in other sessions, what would make these really the most invaluable to you. If you'd like to continue this conversation, by all means, reach out to the team here at the Impact Relations Institute, and we will do our best to facilitate whatever your questions are. And if you are not already, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter, The Agenda, if you go to impactrelations.org, and keep on top of our latest updates. And again, thank you all so much for attending.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.